Ask the Expert session. And this is a follow-up from our digital breakout session where we talked about new innovations for Azure Database for MySQL and PostgreSQL to turbocharge your app development. Today, we're going to answer all of your questions that you may have about the Flexible Server preview announcement we just made. But before we do that, let's quickly go over some housekeeping items. First off, to interact with the team of subject matter experts here, please use the chat to ask any of your questions. And feel free to upvote any of the questions that you're interested in hearing being answered on air with us in the experts here. Please also note that this session may be recorded, so keep that in mind as you ask your questions. And please be polite to all of the other participants in the chat as well as our moderators. I also want to point out that we are following the Microsoft Code of Conduct. And so we're all here today to answer all the questions that you may have about the Flexible Server preview. And if you watched our digital breakout session, you would have learned about all the great features that we've released along with this deployment option. So before we jump into any questions that you may have, I want to do a quick round of introductions. My name is Andrea Lamb, and I'm a senior PM on the Azure Database for MySQL and MariaDB team. Fun fact about me, through this pandemic, I've really gotten into collecting plants, so you can see a couple of them right behind me. I've got about 30 plants now, and I think it might be an addiction, but yeah, we'll see. What about you, Arun?
Hi, everyone. Nice to meet you all. My name is Arun. I'm a principal program manager with the Azure Open Source Databases team. I focus on migrations to open source databases, and I have over 7 years of experience in the migration space. I'm super glad to be here today. And on a lighter note, I'm very happy that I got a chance to go get a haircut yesterday, so I could be camera ready today. Nice to meet you all, and over to you, Lucas, for the introduction.
Perfect. Good to meet everybody. So I'm Lucas Fiddle. I'm a PM on the Azure Database for Postgres team. I joined Microsoft through the Citus data acquisition. So I've been working with Postgres for many years now in the open source community, and I really care about making sure that Microsoft works well with the community, and we've done some good work with the Postgres community here. On a more fun note, I did actually manage to get a bike ride in today between Ignite sessions. So between this session and the previous session, I was able to do a quick bike ride, which to me is important. Like, got to keep working out and stay healthy. So that's for me. Manish.
Hey, thanks, Lucas. Hi, everyone. I'm Manish. I am a PM in the Azure Open Source MySQL and the MariaDB Managed Service team. I joined Microsoft a couple of years ago after working in the MySQL database back in Oracle. Fun fact about me, like everyone else, I refined my cooking skills during this COVID time, and I'm certain it has increased a lot over the last 6-7 months that I've been stuck at home. I'll be the moderator for you guys today. So let's kickstart this conversation. So we announced a bunch of things with the MySQL database and the PostgreSQL database, all along the flexible servers. So Lucas, could you help us understand what exactly flexible server is and why it's interesting for Microsoft to invest in this area?
Of course, yeah. And for that, maybe, Andrea, can we go back a few slides? I think you had the deployment options there earlier. Perfect. So I think the important thing to understand, right, is what we mean by deployment option. So deployment option, you essentially already used it if you use the product, which is if you use single server, right, it's essentially a certain kind of architecture and a certain way of deploying the product, right? A certain, essentially, when you create a server, like a database server, then you choose a single server, for example, is today an option, right? You also have the choice of hyperscale for Postgres. And so essentially with the new flexible server option, we're introducing a new architecture and a new way to deploy Postgres and MySQL into Azure. Really, flexible server is about giving you more control and giving you a simplified developer experience.
That's great to know, Lucas. One question that I'm getting from the attendees is, what's the difference between the already existing single server and the new flexible server? Andrea, could you help clarify that question?
Yeah, happy to. Let me just switch over to one of our slides really quick. So the cool thing about flexible server is it supports a bunch of new features that aren't really available in single server. And this includes a bunch of really great things around security, including VNet integration, as well as more server parameters that we're exposing. So for any of you Postgres or MySQL experts who really want to control particular server parameters, Flexible Server allows you to do so. And I also want to mention custom maintenance windows. And essentially, this allows you to pick the deployment time in which you're going to receive some of the maintenance for your particular Postgres or MySQL engine. And then on top of that, it also supports zone redundant HA, which is one of the really big announcements that we've made as part of Ignite. And this gives you the ability to do synchronous replication between availability zones. So really exciting for those of you that need zone resiliency for your applications. And then a big chunk of our investments have gone into cost optimization, and this includes investing in the Burstable Compute tier, and that's our lowest pricing tier available for Flexible Server. Allows you to bank up CPU credits, a spike up to 100%, very similar to what you see in Azure Virtual Machines. And then we've also introduced stop-start capabilities, allowing you to stop your server for up to 7 days and allowing you to save costs in that way as well.
That's great to know, and I'm certain that this is one of the most appealing product for the developers. In that regard, there's a question that I saw from the attendees. How do we migrate our existing workloads to the new flexible server? Arun, could you help answer this question?
Absolutely. I think that's a great question. Andrea, could you pop over to the migration slide, please? Thank you very much. So as you can see, there are multiple options for you to migrate to open source databases on Azure. Given these databases are open source, you have the option of using native tools and multiple community-based tools to enhance your migration experience and keep the entire migration process as predictable as possible. So as you can see, there are 3 main stages. The pre-migration phase, where you go and evaluate your workload for workload fit from a performance and usability standpoint in Azure Platform as a Service. You discover everything, you migrate the schema, and you start preparing for your migration. And when you're ready to do the actual data migration, you could use a migration tool varied across 3 different sub buckets. So depending on your use case, you could either go in for an offline migration tool that ships with the database engine by itself, like dump and restore, basically like MySQL dump and MySQL and restore, or even PG dump and PG restore for Postgres. You could also use community-based tools that are designed specifically to perform super fast parallel thread-based migrations, including MyDumper and MyLoader. And if you require online migrations to reduce your available downtime, you have a combination of various native and fully managed services. Namely, from a native logical replication standpoint, you could use the binlog replication or data end replication into Azure DB for MySQL, or the newly supported logical replication capabilities, where you're able to use the publisher subscriber capabilities that got introduced in Postgres 10 to be able to perform near zero downtime migrations. And in order for you to get that programmability edge, if you want repeated migrations and repeat them over multiple workloads, you could also choose to use our online migration tool called the Azure Database Migration Service, which is fully managed. It uses some of the concepts that you see from the logical replication tools I just talked about, and enables you to perform near zero downtime online migrations. And once the data is moved, you go into the post-migration phase, you test things out, ensure your apps are ready to go in the Azure platform, and boom, your workload is running in Azure, giving you all of the advantages that come with keeping a leg in the cloud. Back to you, Manish.
Thanks a lot, Arun. I think that's a great set of tools that the customers can use to bring their existing workloads to the flexible server. One question that I see from one of the MySQL developers is, what are some of the flexible pricing options that are available in flexible servers? Andrea, could you help answer that question?
Yeah, so like I mentioned earlier, the Burstable Compute tier is going to be the lowest cost tier that we have. But the way that pricing essentially works in the pricing model, let me just pull up our documentation really quickly for you. And essentially what we do is we break up pricing based on compute and storage. So I'm going to switch over to one of our docs here really quickly, compute and storage here. And essentially what you do is you select the, basically the virtual machine size or compute size in our service. And this is dependent on the compute tier available, so burstable, general purpose, or memory optimized. And each of these is run on either the B series, D series, or E series machines. That allows you to also scale up the vCores, and with that, the memory associated with the machine. And then you can also scale up storage, and so pricing is based on that. So if you guys do want to check out more details in terms of pricing, definitely check out our pricing page. And I'll pop it up here on the screen as well. And you can also use the pricing calculator in pricing calculator available in the pricing details to get a better understanding. Oops, I have a different link open, but it's flexible server pricing to get a better idea of what pricing looks like per region. And so this is flexible server here.
Would you like to touch base on the start-stop capability that customers and developers can use?
Yeah, great call, Manish. So stop-start allows you to basically stop your server for up to 7 days. And essentially what we're doing on the back end is stopping the compute for your server. And so during this time, you'd still have to pay for storage because we still have to keep your data around so that eventually when you restart your server, it actually has data files to connect to. But stop-start is a great idea for anybody who wants to take cost optimization options. Maybe you want to stop your server over the weekend, maybe you don't need it, or dev test scenarios, that type of thing. So definitely a lot of different scenarios that can take advantage of stop-start capabilities. Thanks for that,
Andrea. So Lucas, we have a hyperscale Citus lover. The question is Citus hyperscale still limited to a single database? They are interested in dynamically scaling PostgreSQL performance, but have a completely segmented separate database architecture for separate reasons.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Manish. So let me maybe take a step back and describe a bit more how hyperscale works, right? So first of all, the thing to understand is that the Citus extension is open source, by the way, so you can go look at that on GitHub. And the limitation around using a single database called Citus as the main database really comes from the way that extensions work in Postgres, right? So extensions are on a per database level in Postgres, which means that you have to essentially create them in each database. And so from a kind of management layer perspective, that introduces a lot of complexities if you support multiple databases. So our recommended multi-tenant model is essentially to use what we call kind of shared table multi-tenancy. You can also use row-level security if you need additional kind of security barriers. So to answer your question specifically, today we don't support multiple databases, and it's technically a bit difficult because of the inherent kind of architecture of Postgres extensions. It is something that we know is important to some of our customers, and so we are certainly considering to add it in the future, but I think at this point we don't have an ETA for that.
Okay, thanks for that, Lucas. Another follow-up question from one of the attendees is the presence of zone redundant HA, which is a key differentiator that we called out in one of the previous slides. Could you touch base on that and how that is beneficial to modern enterprise applications?
For sure, yeah, and let's maybe switch back to the slides for that and take a look at the HA architecture. So, or actually, we can also start, well, either of those two works. So the HA architecture here, right, like that we show, this is for flexible server, right? So just important context switch here, we're not talking about flexible server again. And so on the left side here, you can see essentially the availability zone 1. On the right side, you can see the availability zone 2. So in Azure, an availability zone is essentially a set of data centers that are, independent from each other. So that means if there's a power outage or a fiber cut, then, essentially, like if the one zone goes down, the other zone would still be available. And so in order to kind of, understand the benefit here, it's really about, making sure that if you have mission critical workloads that, need to be up and running all the time, the zone resilient option that we're introducing with flexible server is key to that, right? And so the way this works is that you can, you have essentially your primary server in zone 1 here, and then use synchronous streaming replication in Postgres or MySQL to essentially stream all the changes over to that second standby. The reason, the benefit from synchronous, of course, is that it doesn't have any data loss, right? So essentially, it always makes sure that when a transaction comes in, it also gets committed on the second zone. And so that means if the zone 1 goes down, you automatically automatically switch over to the second zone and you have no data loss. The application doesn't need to do anything. It automatically essentially happens when you reconnect.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Lucas, for that explanation. And just to add to that, MySQL, similar to Postgres, MySQL uses the binlog replication, which is the native replication provided by MySQL. And it is again synchronously replicated across the two zones to bring this data resiliency in case of a zone failure. Moving forward, Arun, one question that I'm getting is where can folks go to learn more about the migration processes and what are the best practices for migration?
Absolutely, happy to answer that. Andrea, could you open up the data migration guide for me, please? Thank you very much. So from my experience and based on multiple customers we've helped onboard the Azure platform for both MySQL and Postgres, migrations are multi-step processes, and it almost always helps you to have a framework to go after, use best practices for each step and sub-step in that framework to be able to make sure you have successful migrations that don't add on a lot of risks as you move your data from one place to another. So at Azure, we have the cloud adoption framework, which is roughly split into 3 big steps that make up the entire migration umbrella. We talked about it previously, which it is the one is the pre-migration phase, the migration phase, and the post-migration phase. And to be able to talk to all of these best practices per cloud adoption framework's sub-step, we've come up with this database migration guide that you're looking at on the screen for all of the sources and targets we support from a migration standpoint today. So you will see everything, including SQL Server, MongoDB to Cosmos DB, and everything in here. But specific to migrations to open source databases, Andrea, if you could just pop into one of the migration scenarios there and click into that. So you will see that this is the one example for a Postgres to Azure DB for Postgres migration. You will clearly look at all of the migration best practices from an overview standpoint, what tool to use when, what the supported versions are, what are the recommendations and prerequisites you need to take care of before you start a migration with full focus on successful migrations. And it'll help you go from one stage to another, helps you with those process best practices, ensures you don't miss out on any important step that comes as part of this important migration. The best part is you could do this yourself if you are very familiar with MySQL or Postgres, or on the right-hand side of this page, you will see a list of our partners who are well adept at helping our customers migrate hundreds and thousands of workloads into Azure Database for Postgres and Azure Database for MySQL. So you could reach out to them also. And lastly, I definitely encourage reaching out to us through one of our DLs that Andrea is going to put up on one of our slides today. We'd be happy to help you with any sort of questions from a migration standpoint, or even put you in touch with one of the partners you're looking at on the screen here. Back to you, Manish.
Thanks a lot, Arun. I think that certainly answers the question. So Andrea, one question that I have here from the attendees is, what are some of the new parameters that Flexible Server has made available for customers to tune? Could you share some insights on that?
Yeah, so we have a bunch of InnoDB buffer pool parameters that are available. We've also have a bunch of other parameters like thread pools, and there's a lot really, but one of the other really cool things that we've done is a lot of customers are actually curious about, okay, there's some parameters that I can't tune, and in our current experience for single server, you're not actually able to tell what you can't tune. You can see what you can. So one of the improvements we've actually made within the Azure portal is to also expose parameters that you can't tune, just so you're aware of what the values are. Because otherwise you have to go query your server individually. But this is just a quick way for you to just get a better grasp of all up what the server parameter values are for both the ones that you can and cannot tune. But I also recommend going to check out the documentation to get a better understanding of how you can change the server parameters, and then also take a look at some at the values in the Azure portal today. We're working on exposing more and more, and so if you definitely have some server parameters that you want to be able to configure, you should reach out to us over email. We need that feedback to understand what types of parameters everyone likes to tune.
Yeah, thanks, Andrea. And I think parameter tuning is something that most of the developers look for while they build their modern MySQL applications. So Lucas, one of the attendees wants to better understand the burstable compute type that we have introduced, and what kind of workloads is more suitable for that.
For sure, yeah. And if you were in the session, I think Andrea had a good graph on that. I can try to recapture it again. So essentially, the main benefit of Burstable is that it accumulates credits, right? So essentially, over time, you're gathering credits as your CPU utilization stays below baseline. So for example, baseline could be 10% of CPU utilization, and so as long as your CPU utilization stays below that, it means that you're gaining credits. And if you go above the baseline, then essentially you're using credits, and that allows you to essentially go beyond what the Burstable server usually supports as a baseline and lets you peak up to 100% CPU utilization. And that's really helpful for workloads where, maybe let's take a school, for example, right? Like in the morning, like all the pupils will sign in using the online learning system, for example, and you would have a peak essentially in the morning, but then over the day that will flatten off, and during the night there probably won't be much activity. And so having something that essentially lets you support these peak and burstable workloads is what the Burstable is good for. It's also good if you just want to get started. You just want to provision a quick server. You do care about cost, for example, right? You just want to have something to maybe for development purposes or to play around and kind of get to know the product. And so one key change that we actually made with Flexible Server is that we now also support the VNet option and premium storage options. So compared to the single server option where that was more limited on the basic tier, on the Burstable tier, it's essentially a fully featured kind of entry price point. So if you just want to get started, that's also a great starting point there.
Okay, thanks, Lucas. Along the similar line, I have one more follow-up question for you. Could you talk briefly about the Azure Arc service that was announced today, and what kind of workloads is more suitable for that?
For sure, yeah, and specifically, I assume you're referring to Azure Arc. Azure Arc enabled Postgres hyperscale.
Exactly.
So today we had a couple of announcements regarding Azure Arc, which is essentially our hybrid story. So Azure Arc enabled Postgres hyperscale as part of the Azure Arc data services. And Azure Arc is really about running the databases in environments that are not in Azure, but they're, for example, on-premise. They might even be in GCP or AWS, right? And so essentially you're using the Azure technologies such as Postgres hyperscale in the environment of your choice. So it's really about giving you that flexibility, giving you the ability to run the Azure technology in other locations. And so Postgres hyperscale is, as we talked about earlier, based on the Citus extension. And so if you wanted to run the Citus extension on-premise and have it fully supported by Microsoft, then that's a great choice to use the Azure Arc option. Azure Arc is in public preview starting today, so you can just, try it out. It's pretty easy to scale. The other thing to know about the Azure Arc data services, they are actually built on Kubernetes. So that means when we look at Postgres hyperscale, for example, it actually on Azure Arc scales out using Kubernetes nodes. And so you're essentially first setting up the Kubernetes environment, and then you just seamlessly scale out, seamlessly add more nodes to scale out the Postgres hyperscale cluster.
Sure. Thanks.
So I'm going to make a really quick note here. So on the screen here, you'll see Travis's session that's coming up tomorrow morning Pacific time, which covers everything related to the Azure Arc announcements that came out this week for Ignite. So definitely check that out if you are interested in learning more about PostgreSQL hyperscale with Arc enabled.
Thanks for this. Thanks for that information, Andrea. I have one question for you on the control element of Flexible Server that we are introducing. Could you talk a bit about the scheduled maintenance and the custom scheduled maintenance window that we have introduced on the Flexible Server?
Yeah, for sure. So I'm going to switch over to the Azure portal just because we haven't shown the Azure portal just yet. Let me just pick one of these servers. So this is a existing MySQL Flexible Server that I provisioned. You can see here over on the left side of the screen, you can click on the maintenance page. And what this does is it pulls up the ability for you to choose if you want system managed or custom schedule. And so system managed is basically we pick a time to deploy any maintenance to your server. That includes maybe like a minor version upgrade for your engine. Maybe we have new security patches or we're releasing new functionality. You'll typically see some type of deployment from our team monthly. And so if you choose system managed, this will essentially roll out during what we consider an off-peak business hour for your particular region. And it really just depends on, the time depends on the region itself. Otherwise, if you pick custom schedule, you can see here, I then get the ability to choose the day of the week that I want this deployment to occur, as well as the start time. And so we give you a time window in which you'll get that maintenance. So really great for any of you who have, like business critical applications where and you need better control of when any potential downtime may be, and allows you to actually get more fine-tuned control for anything that can happen to your server.
Thanks for that, Andrea. Lucas, we are getting a bunch of Postgres questions. So one of the questions that we are having from one of the attendees is, can we install custom PostgreSQL extensions and full text search files in Flexible Server?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And, with my personal background on the Postgres side, of course, I would love to allow all extensions and allow, anything that can be installed to be installed. I think, unfortunately, the reality of a managed service is a bit different. It is actually, important for us to verify the security and make sure that, there's no risks essentially that come to the database itself from, allowing any custom code to run. So today, the way that it works on Flexible Server is pretty much similar to single server, which is that, it is a kind of, list of allowed extensions that we manage. And we are planning to add a lot more extensions on Flexible Server. On the specific questions of kind of text search and like other, custom files that are not extensions, that's a very interesting use case. And I think that's actually something that I personally didn't know about, and I learned from like a customer essentially asking us about this, I think a couple of months ago. And I think this is something that we're exploring. We don't have a good way to do this today. Again, security is the risk here, right? Like, how do we make sure you can upload things and essentially it's safe to run on a database environment? But it's definitely something that we are evaluating. We're trying to see if we can support in the future.
Okay, thanks for that. A follow-up question on from one of the attendees is around Azure Arc. Azure Arc enabled data services will allow to run Postgres on Azure Stack.
Yes, that's a great question. So yes, if you have an Azure Stack deployment today, or you're looking to purchase Azure Stack, you can run the Azure Arc data services on that. In fact, the Azure Arc team is collaborating closely with the Azure Stack team. It's part of the test pipeline to make sure that Azure Stack and Azure Arc work well together. And that includes running Postgres Hyperscale on Azure Stack using Azure Arc.
Okay. Andrea, a question for you. On the burstable option, is it on the roadmap to increase vCores option for production workloads?
So like maybe Lucas or I mentioned earlier, part of the re-architecturing that we've done for our base platform for Flexible Server is to start using public compute VMs. And so some of the things that we're looking into is, as the compute team lights up new VM SKUs, how we can potentially adopt those into our service. So as stands right now, with the B series compute, we have support for 1 to 2 vCores. And so potentially if there is more support for larger vCores in the Burstable series as it comes, then yeah, we'll definitely look into potentially lighting that up in Flexible Server as well.
Okay, so we have last 2 minutes. A quick question for Arun. Do we support Oracle to Postgres migration?
That's a great question. Absolutely. It's we've been helping a number of customers move their Oracle workloads into Postgres. In fact, we have a big motion going on around it. The same data migration guide you saw earlier has all of the best practices that you could go look at from an Oracle to Azure database for Postgres migration. It'll walk you through all of those steps we talked about. In fact, we have brilliant field teams that help our customers who've come up with ways and scripts that can help automate different parts of a tough heterogeneous migration like Oracle to Postgres. So if you have an Oracle workload, you'd like to see it run on Postgres, please feel free to reach out to us. Please feel free to check this guide and let us know what you think. It walks you through some of the open source tools available out there, best practices around how to go in, install and run them like Oracle PG, and go about using these open source tools and fully managed services like Azure Database Migration Service to move data and prepare and fully finish your migrations to Postgres from Oracle. So that there are several details available in this guide. And if you have more questions, please feel free to reach out to us.
Thanks a lot, Arun. And thanks a lot, Lucas, Andrea, and everyone who joined this session and the wonderful questions that you had. Thanks a lot.